I want to explain a little bit about understanding in-text citations. Even if you think you know how to cite your sources inside of a paper and the reference list, you should watch this video because there's some things about citations that you may not know, and there's a lot to it, so I want to explain this a little bit further. To give us the context here, in APA citation style, you often use the word citation interchangeably with references. But the citation itself is what we refer to when we're talking about what's inside the document. So when you're acknowledging an outside source, you're going to use an in-text citation to let the reader know that words or ideas were not your original ideas, that you've used those to support your main argument. And references are the list of sources that you use that's placed at the end of the document. It's otherwise known as a bibliography. In an MLA citation style, it's called a works cited page. In APA, it's called references, and each reference in your list needs to have a corresponding citation in the document itself, so that a reader, as they're reading your paper, can look at what source you're citing inside the paper, what information are you using from another source, and look at the reference so that they can go read that source themselves. So that's some basic guidelines here. So when do you need to use an in-text citation? You need to use them and supply them whenever the information that you're including in your paper is not common knowledge. If it's not common knowledge, it means you got that information from somewhere, so you need to acknowledge the source. When you're integrating ideas or words that are not your own, anytime you do that, you need to include an in-text citation. Again, even if they're ideas. When we're talking about word for word, that's called a direct quote. But when we're integrating an idea or summarizing someone else's ideas, you need to also include an in-text citation. When you're switching sources, there are times when you will be using multiple sources to make a point, even within one paragraph. So anytime you are integrating two different sources, you need to indicate that by switching the citation in your document. And the in-text citation itself needs to go inside the sentence that you're integrating that outside information from. I'll explain that a little bit more in a second here. So how to cite your sources. So I'm going to give you an example. So sleep is important for overall health. And this is what we would consider common knowledge. Everyone kind of knows that. We don't really need to cite a source that tells us that because it's relatively understood that sleep is good for our health. But if we say something a little more specific, as psychologists have learned that ambient light before bedtime can delay the onset of sleep and production of melatonin, this is not considered common knowledge, so it needs an in-text citation. So if you were to use that sentence in your paper, presuming this is a summarized, paraphrased information from a podcast, and you needed to cite that source, the citation would look like it's going to come in right at the end of the sentence here before the period. And the elements, the parts of a citation are the author's last name or author's last name and the year of publication. So that's the first element of what's called a parenthetical citation, the author's last name. Then there's a comma and the year of publication. And you can see that's placed inside parentheses right before the end of that sentence. So to the reader, this is indicating that the information within that sentence is from the Bee and Julie podcast. There are several different types of in-text citations. Again, it occurs in the body of paper to acknowledge support from other sources. A parenthetical citation is just what I just showed you. The example here is where it's within parentheses, otherwise known as parenthetical, and it acknowledges the author or authors and the year of publication. A narrative citation is when you identify the author as a first part of a sentence, or an example like I show you here, and the year follows immediately following. This pretty much happens when you're using this method. Sternberg, 2018, concluded that decision making is comprised of, and he went on in that sentence. So assuming this is not a direct quote, you can do that right there, and it's considered a complete citation. You can also include it in the middle of a sentence if you're switching sources. So for example, you can see here in this that there are two different sources that say two different things. So you need to acknowledge that they're coming from two different places and two different sources. Now this can be a little tricky when you're using multiple different sources, but that's indicating that the first part of that sentence is from the Myers-DeWall text, and the second part of that sentence is from a different source. You also need to use in-text citations when you're directly quoting. However, in API citation style, you should use direct quotes very conservatively and really only use them when there's no way to paraphrase or summarize. And generally, your goal should be to eliminate direct quotes entirely. However, in some circumstances, you will need to use them if there's a specific quote from somebody that you just can't summarize for some reason. In this case, if you're using a simple direct quote from another source, you need to put that word for word part in quotation marks. And in your in-text citation, you'll use the same sort of elements or parts. The author's last names, the year of publication, but then you'll add the page number for which that quotation comes from. If you're using an internet source, then you don't need to include that. Another example of a direct quote or situation where you need to use an in-text citation a little bit differently is when you have a quote that's within a source that you're using for your paper. So the best way around this, so for example, if you have a journal article and they say, as Freud says, and then they quote that source, and you're using their citation, then the best way around it is just go find that original source so that you can read that source itself, but also so that you are finding that source material, that primary resource, and using it effectively. One way around it too, other than just going and finding the source, is you can use the as cited by option. So here's an example. The source would have been the Mitchell and Black book, but in that book they're citing something or quoting something that you also want to use. So the example is Freud, and you put in parentheses, as cited by Mitchell and Black. So that indicates the source is not a Freud book, or a book written by Freud or article written by Freud. It's by Mitchell and Black and stated that, and then the quote by Freud. But you're going to use the year publication for the book that you have in hand and the page number. So again, always cite the source that you have in hand to avoid source plagiarism. And then that way you can still use additional sources within that source, but you need to include it as cited by. It can be a little confusing to balance all that. But that's why it's always best to just go back to the original source. Again, all your citations need to have a corresponding reference in your reference list. This is a page, standalone page at the end of your document that lists all the sources that you've used. You should title that page at the top saying references, not works cited. Works cited is MLA. So center that at the top. And then the list of your sources need to be in alphabetical order by first element. And that first element, if you don't have an author, then you're going to use the second element, which is often a year or the title. But generally speaking, you should be using articles that have authors. In terms of evaluating your sources, authored articles are the best ones, are considered most legitimate. And then lastly, include elements by category. Each reference has certain elements that need to appear within that reference, and you find out what those elements or parts of that reference are by using the APA publication manual. You can also check out the Purdue OWL website. It has the most updated edition, and also just do a Google search. But make sure if you do a Google search that you're using the current edition of the APA publication manual. But it'll tell you exactly what the elements are. And how do you find those elements? Well, there's a couple of places. If you're using a book, you can use the title page. That's going to give you some information on the book cover, but also the versid, which is usually 3 or 4 pages in. That includes all the publication information. You'll find a lot of information there. If you're using a website, it can be a little more challenging, but always look at the very top of a web page. At the very bottom of a web page, often you'll find dates or authors' names in places that you might not typically find them. But again, most of what you're going to be using is journal articles or primary sources, so typically they're pretty easy to find the elements. And that's the basics of in-text citations and references. We'll be providing you with more information about that as we continue on in the semester. Thanks.